Welcome to Red, White, and Weekly. I'm creating this series for the hobbyist historian, like myself, to learn about the year leading up to our great nation's independence in 1776. So many books have been written on the American Revolution, and there is so much information on the subject, it is impossible for me to include everything. This series is for entertainment purposes only. It is not meant to be textbook. So let's begin. Briefly, I learned to love history and really became an all-out history geek in 1976. I was 11 years old, and our nation was celebrating the bicentennial year, our 200th birthday. You would have had to have lived under a rock, not to get caught up in all the pomp and celebration that went on all year long. There was even an evening bicentennial minute, which taught us what happened on that exact day in 1776. It was really something to look forward to, and it really was a year-long 4th of July celebration. I loved it, and I was there for it. Those experiences and memories are exactly where my idea for this series came from. America's semi-quincentennial will be celebrated next summer, July 4th of 2026. And once again, and 50 years later, I'm here for it. So beginning this July 4th and through next July 4th, we will spend approximately 15 minutes together each week. Today's going to be maybe a little longer, watching 13 squabbling colonies through sheer grit and against all odds become the United States of America. I am your host, Kelly Haven. Join me and become witness to the most unlikely revolution in world history. Before we dive into July of 1775, we need to understand how we arrived there. By that July, blood had already been spilled. Armies were facing off, and families across America were asking themselves a terrifying question. Is this really happening, and are we going to war? The cause for America that gave birth to a new nation and the crisis that then engulfed the Atlantic world in the late 18th century inspired British Americans, indigenous nations, and Europeans alike. They began to question their loyalties, to challenge authority, and to seek freedom. Our story actually begins on April 19th of 1775. We will call it the Spark, Lexington and Concord, when British General Thomas Gage made a fateful decision. He ordered 700 of his best soldiers on a secret nighttime march to Concord, Massachusetts, a 20-mile mission with two clear objectives: destroy the colonial weapon stockpile and arrest the ringleaders of this growing rebellion. Sound plan, it seems. Let's see how that unfolds. Now, who are these ringleaders that Gage is worried about? None other than John Hancock and Samuel Adams, two men who had spent years turning Boston into a hotbed of resistance. Hancock, one of the wealthiest merchants in New England, had been using his fortune to fund the Sons of Liberty, cool name, and smuggle goods to avoid British taxes. Samuel Adams, a master propagandist and political organizer, had practically turned rabble-rousing into an art form. He had organized the Boston Tea Party, none other than, orchestrated protests, and wrote inflammatory articles that spread anti-British sentiment throughout the colonies, purposely, of course. Now, to General Gage, these two men represented everything that was wrong with Massachusetts. They were wealthy, influential, and absolutely determined to undermine the crown and British authority. The plan did not go exactly how Gage had wanted. But what went wrong? Well, everything. Everything. Thanks to Paul Revere, another trusted member of the Sons of Liberty, and a Boston silversmith who had become far more than just a craftsman. Revere was an accomplished horseman who had carried secret messages between colonial leaders for years. and a man with connections throughout the Massachusetts countryside. When he learned of the British plans, he knew exactly what to do and exactly whom to warn. And yes, he really did ride that night. Although he didn't yell, "The British are coming," he would have shouted, "The regulars are out." Because before independence, everyone was British. Now, at dawn in Lexington, about 70 colonial militiamen, mostly farmers, clutching their muskets, faced 700 British soldiers. Someone fired a shot. To this day, nobody knows who, but Ralph Waldo Emerson would later call it the shot heard round the world. The British managed to scatter that local militia and marched on to Concord. Mission accomplished, right? They did destroy some weapons and they had a bit of a skirmish. Then they began to head home. Gage did not, however, capture Hancock or Adams in that outing. As the British were retreating, things with the colonial army were getting interesting. Word had spread faster than wildfire regarding the skirmish at Lexington, and every farm, every village between Concord and Boston began to empty out. Farmers grabbed their hunting rifles. Shopkeepers closed up and reached for their muskets. At dawn, the Brits were not facing 70 militiamen. They were now facing thousands. For miles, colonial fighters used every stone wall, tree, barn, fence as cover. They picked off British soldiers like they were hunting deer on Thanksgiving morning. That proud British Army, veterans of many European battlefields, found themselves running through a gauntlet of angry farmers who knew every inch of their own countryside better than the back of their hands. By the time the British limped back into Boston, they had lost 273 men. The Colonials, only 95. More importantly, word spread through all 13 colonies faster than you could saddle a horse. The attitudes of these farmers and shopkeepers slowly began to change. They felt hope, even excitement. They dared to think, even speak. We can win this fight. We can win our freedom. If Lexington was a wake-up call, Bunker Hill was a full-blown alarm bell. By June of 1775, thousands of colonial militia had surrounded Boston, trapping the British Army inside the city like birds in a cage. Boston was becoming a powder keg. The Colonials decided to get bold. On the night of June 16th, about 1,200 of them snuck onto Charlestown Peninsula and started digging. And by morning, they had built a fort or redoubt on Breed's Hill. Breed's Hill, not Bunker Hill. Why is it the Battle of Bunker Hill? Supposedly, it was British that confused the two hills, and the name stuck. Now, the British woke up and saw colonial cannons pointing down at their ships from the hill. As General Howe assessed the landscape, he probably choked on his morning tea. Those colonials had to be removed, and there was really only one way they could accomplish that: a frontal assault going up the hill. Now, 18th century European armies fought in neat lines, marching directly at each other like gentlemen. It was civilized. It was traditional. It was also incredibly stupid. When you're charging uphill against farmers who had been hunting since they could hold a rifle. Provincial Colonel William Prescott allegedly told his men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." That's exactly what they did. So they waited. And they waited. And when those red-coated British soldiers got close enough, well, the first British assault crumbled. Bodies were everywhere. The second assault, same result. General Howe was watching and scratching his head. His professional army was getting shredded by what he considered a mob of lowly farmers. The third assault finally succeeded, but only because the Colonials ran out of ammunition. They had held off the British Army for hours. with hunting rifles and whatever gunpowder they could actually scrape together. But the numbers told the story. Britain lost over 1,000 men, including 226 dead. The colonials lost about 400. But here's the kicker. The British actually won. They took the hill, and it was one of the most expensive victories and lives lost in British modern military history. General Howe supposedly said afterward, a few more such victories would have surely put an end to British dominion in America. You can't win a war by losing 1,000 soldiers every time you capture a hill. As I've stated, news travels quickly through the region, and the news of Bunker Hill spread like a fever. In Virginia, a young plantation owner named George Washington read the reports and probably realized his comfortable life was about to get very complicated. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress suddenly understood they weren't just filing complaints from the colonies anymore. No, they were actually running an all-out war. By July 1775, families were being torn apart. Neighbors who had known each other for decades had to choose sides. About 1/3 of colonials supported independence. 1/3 remained loyal to Britain, and about 1/3 just wanted everyone to stop shooting at each other so they could get back to making a living. The economy was in free fall. British trade had virtually stopped. Colonial merchants found themselves smuggling goods they used to import legally. Prices were rising, currency was becoming worthless, and there was a chill in the air. Winter was on its way, which meant armies needed food, clothing, and supplies that were increasingly difficult to find. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, that Continental Congress was trying to figure out how to run a war without actually declaring a war. And that is where this series really begins, because on July 4th of 1775, all of these pressures, all of these impossible decisions, all of these frightened, desperate, but very hopeful people were about to collide in ways that nobody could have predicted. America is at war, but won't admit it. Britain is losing and won't accept it. And somewhere in the middle, ordinary people like us are trying to figure out how to build a nation while everything they have ever known falls apart around them. When we meet again, we will see what happens when George Washington shows up in Boston to take command of an army that exists mostly on paper. Spoiler alert, it doesn't go well. Thank you for joining me today. Again, I am your host, Kelly Haven, and this is Red, White, and Weekly. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.